2nd, 2010 special called work session. The work session is an informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken. Tonight there are two items on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it in to the city clerk's staff. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public comment cards will be accepted. Will the city clerk please call the first agenda item?
First item is presentation of revised financial model results for the comprehensive plan. George Ragsdale, Chairman CPAC.
George, can I say a couple things before you
Sure,
get started? Do you mind?
Yeah.
Just so I can. Hey, Alan.
Yeah, sorry, I'm late.
That's right. Just so I can bring everybody up to speed with some of the direction, or some of the conversations that George and I have had with respect to what you're going to see tonight. And I haven't seen what you're going to see tonight, so we're all going to see it together for the first time, which is fine. At the last meeting where we talked about this financial model, one of the questions we had was largely around what do we do with the anticipated savings that we believe we have after the CH2M Hill transition. We've been public, and we continue to say publicly, and I'm very comfortable supporting it, that we estimate at least the savings in this first fiscal year to be somewhere around the $1.3 million mark, and then some additional recurring costs that won't be needed in future budget years that we just don't have to rebuy. We don't have to rebuy new software every year, don't have to rebuy new computers. So the question came up is what of that $1.3 million or that $1 million in year 2 and 3 and on, what portion of that might potentially be reallocated by the council in the form of a mid-year budget amendment? What's actually going to be reallocated to other projects, whether they be capital projects or other needs of the city? And it becomes kind of an interesting thing to figure out where you get that number, if the number even exists, and what direction you can provide to somebody like George with CPAC to say, okay, this is what I think the financial model should include. We've talked individually, I think each of you, we've talked about this model and about what some of the different options are. I think from what I understand from our staff today, you're going to see a couple of different options tonight that probably span all ends of the spectrum. I don't know what that number is, and I don't have the magic ball. I can tell you that when we go through a mid-year budget process, we will drill down as to what that exact number is. I've shared with all of you that I think that you know that one of the things that I look at very strongly when I look at our budget and say, what, of anything, did we potentially underfund this year? Pavement management is one of those things if you go by the pavement management plan that we have as the city. So I lay that foundation to say it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel and picking out a number. What is the right number? We'll know that, or we'll be better at knowing that once we get through the mid-year budget process. But as I understand it, George has a couple of different models to show to you tonight. I can tell you I will take responsibility for asking George, at least with one of the models that he's presenting tonight, to say that of that $1.3 million, the council would likely allocate $1 million of that, of the 1.3. Have some in savings. I'll tell you the way I got to that number was to know that we funded pavement management this fiscal year at $1.4 million, knowing very well that the plan that Kimley Horn did said we needed to fund it at $2.25 million per year. So I know that if you intend on funding that at 100%, it's going to require an additional roughly $800,000 of allocating money to it. How I got to $1 million was I said, I am sure there is something out there the council will want to fund. I just don't know what it is. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Maybe you don't intend on funding any of it and leaving the funding in place where we are today with the approved budget. But that's that was the rationale where I got to that number. I asked George for at least one of his models to be a model that showed that we reappropriated $1 million of that 1.3 in year 1, as well as then saved $300,000 in year 2 and year 3 and year 4, etc. So there's going to be a model where you see 1.3 in the first year and $1 million in the second year, I'm thinking, but then you're also going to see one that is less than that, and that's kind of the middle ground that I guess I was starting to glean from individual council members when I met with them. So if there's any questions as to how we came up with that number, now you know. Had some rationale behind it. Certainly not scientific and not perfect, but I just want you to know that I'll take the responsibility for that model when we get to that one. Is it's kind of a middle ground. So, George, having said that, I hope I didn't steal your thunder.
No, not at all. Not at all. Always happy when somebody else takes blame. The first couple pages here are not going to be anything new, and they're not going to work anyway, so. Okay. These first few pages are the same graphs that we presented the last time, and I'm not going to go over them again. I don't think, Michelle, does everybody have the handout or not? The council?
No.
Okay. We'll get you these things in hard copy, but the first few slides are exactly the same as what we looked at before. Just a review of what the revenue assumptions were, a review of what the expense assumptions were.
George, did you turn the power on?
Sorry?
The power button on the side, did you turn that off?
Yeah, it would help. It's not helping. Okay. So these assumptions are the same. As Chris indicated, with respect to the 2010, 2011, the reductions that we shared with you last time were based on 1.3 million in 2010, 1 million in 2011. We've retained one of those models, but the other models have looked at different assumptions around how that savings could be reallocated. Debt service, constant, and the idea of there being no extraordinary one-time expenses. All we're saying is we didn't try and make any decision about where any savings should be spent. All we did was reflect them as savings in the budget. Again, same assumptions on population growth, etc. Same assumptions. Now, these are the models that we wanted to go over tonight. And obviously we can create as many as we want. The direction that we got last time we met with you was that you wanted us to try and look at what the financial situation would look like per the model if we built everything out in accordance with the current future land use plan. So we took a bunch of different scenarios and tried to look at that with the current future land use plan. That's what FLU is supposed to stand for. With the current future land use plan and retaining that full $2.3 million of savings that we had talked about last time. We looked at an example at the other end with the future land use plan and assumed that we spent that entire amount, so zero savings per se. And then we used as a middle ground the one that Chris talked about with $300,000 savings in 2010, another $300,000 in 2011 for a total of $6 million. And then just for the sake of argument, just to see what kind of an impact it would have, we took that same model with the $600,000 savings and said, what would it mean if we increased the millage rate by $500,000? Recognizing that that's not something we have the discretion to do, still from a modeling standpoint, it was something that we thought might be worth looking at. Lastly, we took Model A, which was the model that we had brought last time to the meeting as our recommendation for going forward, kind of as a benchmark, and then adjusted that down to the 600,000 level of savings that Chris had indicated a few minutes ago. So the only difference between those last two is it's the previous Model A, which was based again on building out what was already, what had already been zoned but not built, as opposed to the comprehensive land use plan. The comprehensive land use plan, in the future land use plan, there are a number of areas where there is growth that is in the future land use plan that will require some significant rezoning, but the direction that we got last time was use that plan. So that's what those first four models are about. If we look at the future land use plan, this is just to try and give you a sense. The chart and the graph are the same. The chart indicates the total number of acres in each of the areas and the total number of acres that are available to be converted in each of those areas per the future land use plan.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
When you said to be converted, meaning converted to either commercial or office, or also converted to a different residential?
As you can see over here, these are the ways that they were converted in each of the models that we're going to look at. So MDR is supposed to be medium density residential, C is commercial, L is low-density residential, H is high-density residential. So as an example, in Arnold Mill, the future land use plan only called for an additional 1.5 acres to be converted to commercial, 4.5 acres to medium-density residential, and so on down the line.
And again, based on the current future land use
Correct.
plan. And thinking about Arnold Mill for a moment, obviously the prior future land use plan that we then adopted, which identified that as a neighborhood node, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later this evening, but is it contemplated that those 6 acres were the 6 that would be part of that neighborhood activity node?
Those 6 acres are in that area,
Within that
yes.
area.
Yeah. If you remember, though, from the models we talked about last time, and we'll use Arnold Mill as a good example, the amount of acreage that's being converted in this case is significantly less than what we had talked about in the models that we talked about last time. And you'll see the impact of that as we look at these. I mean, the amount of commercial you can see going down here is relatively small in terms of total acreage that's being added compared to what we had talked about last time. And it'll show up, I think, in the models. Okay, so for the first one, this is the future land use plan as is, with the savings projection at the 2.3 million that we had talked about before. So it's analogous, if you will, to the Model A that we talked about last time in that respect. I didn't do that. What you'll see is that the revenues are just slightly ahead of expenses through about 2016, and after that, the expenses will exceed revenues by a slight margin. And in all cases, what we've done is just tried to make sure that the land use plan matches the population model in every case. So that the population model projection is about 43,000 out in 2028. Every one of these models will hit that population projection by adjusting whatever it is, low density or medium density or high density residential, to try and pick that up.
Question.
Sure.
The previous slide where you've identified the character areas?
Yes.
Are those all of the character areas?
They are.
Refresh my memory.
They are.
Okay,
There's 8 of them.
How does Highway 9, or where is Highway 9 included?
It's primarily in here, Bill, in the Deerfield area. So when we look at that graphically, this is what it looks like graphically, and you can see out to about 2014-ish, we're ahead, and then we start to fall off. This is, again, with the 2.3 million of savings built into here. We looked at the same model, future land use plan. Land use is exactly the same, and all we did was adjust for the 2.3 million. We took it out completely and assumed that we didn't have any savings, or spent it all on something. And as a result, revenues never exceed expenses. The red line, by the way, is the expense line. The green dots through here is the revenue. Okay. Same thing, again, future land use plan. In this case, what we assumed was the 600,000 of savings, 300 this year, 300 next year, and then carried that on out. And what you...
Do you want to just say next when you want to?
How about next? Sorry. Thank you. It only took me 10 slides to figure that out. Sorry, go back. Go back one. So in this case, the revenue doesn't cover expenses after basically this year. Go forward one, and the graph will reflect that. Next one, please. This one took exactly the same thing, and all we did was add in a $500,000 increase in the tax base, or in the assessment rate. And what you find is that same graph carries out to about 2014. So you get about 3 years plus or minus 4 years of before the break-even point occurs. Obviously, if the millage rate goes up more, that line would extend further out. And by the way, the reason this thing's flattening out here is because the model basically, because we're looking at a 20-year horizon, we kind of cut it off. We didn't really deal with what's going on out there after that period of time. Next, please. Okay, Model A If you remember from last time, Model A was what we had recommended at the last session based on, again, taking everything that had been currently zoned but not built out and then converting some portion of that as needed to achieve A, the population growth model, and then B, to try and match revenue and expenses. And if we look at that one, this is the conversion plan, and as you can see, as an example, and if I remember the other one, it was about 1.5 acres, 4.5 acres, I think,
Yes, 6.
that was being converted in Arnold Mill. Here it's 133. Significant difference in terms of the amount of commercial that is being converted in those two areas, the two that are in red, in order to achieve the revenue. The reality of this model is that if you take the millage rate out of the equation, the only lever we have to be able to increase revenue is really increasing the amount of commercial, because the residential carries cost with it that's directly proportional to the amount of revenue that we're getting from the residential side of the equation. All these cases achieve the growth model on the population side. This is the lever that we have in the model to be able to increase on the revenue side. We've not done anything to reduce expenses. All these expenses are built into there and then just escalating over time. So it's assumed that the expenses are just going to escalate as cost of living and so on increases. And there's what that graph looks like. Okay? We took one last look here and said, okay, if we take, sorry.
George,
Paul.
before you go on,
Sure.
could you give an explanation of that last graph? You said that's what the graph looks like. What do you, versus expenses versus revenues, where does that get us doing what you just said?
Well, it's basically all the way out to 2028. It's pretty, there's a little area in here where expenses exceed revenue, and then it comes back to being approximately equal. It's
So-
basically on target all the way out through the planned horizon.
Okay.
And then the last one, we took that same model, which again is not based on the future land use plan, it's based on what we had recommended before, and we adjusted the savings down to 600,000 from the 2.3 million. And when you do that, the land use is exactly the same as it was in the other model. Next one. But what happens is that we break away back in here because we've given up that expense. The savings of the 2.3 down to 1.7. So, with that in mind, and this is, I don't have a model that reflects this because, to be quite honest, two things have happened. One, everything you see up here is really the product of a lot of discussion that has not taken place with CPAC. We talked about it when we had our last meeting, but the 600,000 direction that Chris described early on, we just talked about this week. So a lot of these things had to be created after that. But based on that, I think the sense that I had anyway was that what we wanted to do was to try and use the current future land use plan as a base. We can assume staffing transition savings. You're going to have to tell us what. Seems like around some middle ground, be it 3 or 5, is a good number. But then we've got to try and convert some additional commercial in Arnold Mill and Deerfield in order to be able to get parity, at least through the 5-year horizon. This plan will be required to be updated again in 5 years. Whether 2016 is where we want to try and hit, or whether we want to go beyond that through the whole 20-year horizon, is really your call. But we need to have some direction going forward to be able to kind of lock this down. We can create as many different models and as many different iterations as you want, but I think what you're seeing is that there's a lot of sensitivity around how much commercial we allow in. And by the way, when we look at the future land use plan, I don't want to mislead anybody. The future land use plan includes about 2 million square feet of commercial development. Because you're not talking about what's zoned, you're talking about what the future land use plan is. There's 2 million square feet of additional commercial development that's in the future land use plan. So, having said that, that's where we are. What questions do you have? Alan?
In looking at these projections and keeping in mind that you just said in our current land use plan, we're talking about 2 million more square feet of commercial development. And your model's showing that if that 2 million square feet were completely built out, we would still be running below where we need to be as far as revenues versus expenses. I'm having a hard time figuring out what additional commercial would do if you add that back into the model, because I guess the assumption is that we're going to have somebody come and build 2 million square feet of commercial plus all the additional recommended commercial too, which I don't think is going to happen.
Right. I hear you. I mean, the model is a piece of paper, and it's based on an assumption that everything that we have put into there is going to be built out on the time frame that we've included in here, which is linear. And it also assumes that it's going to be not only built out, but occupied and used. Although the bulk of the revenue comes from the property tax and not from the use tax, but nonetheless, it still is an assumption that's going to be built out and used. And
That's 100,000, that's an average of 100,000 a year for
Correct.
20 years.
correct.
I'd just like to make a comment too, based on where Chris started out, and, you know, talking about middle-of-the-road numbers and all, and savings, but, you know, I have one can see where we could easily spend $1 million more on our infrastructure and our paving, you know, parks, whatever, so I don't think that's being very aggressive, you know, at all with, you know, even hitting it on a little bit higher.
It's a lot easier to talk about the way you want to spend the money than it is to talk about where you're going to get the money.
So, but my point is, you know, I would be more in favor of being conservative, and, because we certainly need, you know, we're getting behind on our infrastructure and intersections and paving and whatnot, so.
And I think when it comes to infrastructure, when you get further behind, it costs you even more
It does.
to get caught back
Exponentially.
up. So I think that's somewhere we don't want to get behind, because it will cost us more in the long run to get caught back up. So I mean, personally, I feel like we've got to have that 850,000 so that we're at least on the plan that we have, I assume, approved based on what Kimberly Horn has presented for the next 10 years to get us to where we need to be at infrastructure-wise. So we don't get further behind.
So using that, I would say that we ought to be looking at the 600 as the target in order to get the 7.7 million over the first.
It may be
2 years.
great if we could put 2.3 million in the bank, but I don't think that's going to be realistic unless we don't want all of our roads to be dirt roads 20 years from now.
Well, to the point, it is actually, in a way, putting money in the bank if you're keeping up with your infrastructure rather than having it crumble and having to spend twice as much to repair it.
Again, I think, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, we kind of got two different animals here, right? If we lock in the 600,000, that's one thing, but we've got the future land use plan, which is inherent in that plan is a fair amount of rezoning. And if then we've got the other plan that we projected, or we presented the last time we were here, which also has rezoning, but very little rezoning. Most of that is taking advantage of land that's already in the plan and zoned but not built, except for the Deerfield and the Arnold Mill areas. Those are the two areas where there's a significant amount of rezoning. But again, there's a significant amount of rezoning in the future land use plan as well.
I know that I inquired about where we are, and obviously we have not had our updated budget work session before we get to talk about where we are in the current fiscal period. Beyond the cost savings from the CH2 Hill contract, can you maybe, and I know Stacy's not here, but can you speak to kind of where we are? I know that we're doing better than we had anticipated at this point, but obviously we're also on a month-to-month assessment.
Right.
And I guess my point of that is going to be that we really don't know where we are in the current fiscal cycle at this point. What I'd like to think, though, is that we're being as conservative as we can be and should be, which means, in theory, we could end up with more than that 1.3 million in savings, depending on where these numbers end up over the next few months. But if you could just speak to that.
I can, and sorry that I didn't bring them in here. I've got copies of our February financials, and where we are year to date, at least for the time period, October to February 28th, I guess it was this year, is expenditures are less than anticipated by 12.1%. It's hard to look at those financial statements and make a whole lot of sense out of them because of the fact that the tax digest was so late in being released last year. It shows that we have collected property taxes at 176% of what we anticipated in the budget. So it's hard to say exactly where that 176% versus, on paper, it looks like we have collected a whole lot of money, and we've saved a little bit, which is a great position to be in. I don't think it's nearly that rosy, because we need to now look at the last fiscal year to be able to come up with a good idea as to where that is. Yes, are we conservative and very ultra-conservative in any spending choice we make day to day? Absolutely. The other thing I want to caution us about when we look at those financial reports, though, is when you look at them and you have a line item that shows what expenditures are, when we look at where we should be year to date, you almost take a full line and divide by 12 and incrementally increase it 12 times over the fiscal year. And that doesn't always necessarily track funds in or expenses out, because we might have something where we look like we are that we've saved a whole lot of money at this point in the year when that expense may not be coming till July, for example. So are we on track? Yes. Are we conservative? Yes. Do I think that we have spent less than we anticipated to spend at this point in the budget year? Yes. If I have to tell you a number, that number today is 12.1%. Yes, I can tell you we have an expert in that stuff, and she's not here. She's on vacation. She could almost provide you up to the minute line item totals as to where we are year to date. I kind of look at them in more cost center type in that setting. But I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of gotten it to where at least I hope to give you that certain kind of percentage.
I guess my point was that because we haven't gotten through that budget assessment collectively together, is that it may be that before we can really say, okay, do we think that 600,000 is the right number, that until we kind of go through that mid-year evaluation, it's tough to say, because hopefully we will have been more conservative than what we originally budgeted, and that some of that 12.1% savings will indeed be savings that we can anticipate through the end of the fiscal year. I'm just a little concerned about tonight saying, I think the number 600, when we're looking at it without having the full dialogue of everybody sitting around this table, including Stacy, who's not at the table, to be able to say, okay, well, what other expenses have we incurred that we maybe didn't expect, which I don't think we have those right now, but what might we expect, and then how do we combine those either savings or additional expenditures with how we would potentially prioritize some of the spending of these dollars. I very much agree that we want to continue to obviously support repaving, et cetera, but if we're looking at perhaps even further reductions in revenue, I think we also have to be smart and perhaps even get more conservative than what we've been over this next period of time that's an unknown. I mean, I surely don't want to be spending every dollar that we're taking in. I'm concerned about that. So I think perhaps we need to go back and see if we can sharpen the pencil a little bit more in some of those other areas before we necessarily say we're going to expend all of the 1.3 or half of that 1.3. Of course, knowing that we want to keep up with our infrastructure, but I just continue to be cautious, as I think all of us are, in terms of where our revenues are going to be relative to expenses. So.
Yeah, I'd say that oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're next.
All right. I mean, in terms of my takeaway from the hard work that you guys have been doing, George, and really appreciate you guys going back and doing this yet again, is, what we're really looking at is some kind of target window, a window of what's going to happen in the future. I mean, projections, like George said, they're just on a piece of paper. Who really knows what's going to happen? But we do understand where our revenue could be. We do understand where our expenses could be. We do understand that we've got potential savings that we're going to realize over the next, or ongoing, over the years to come. So armed with that information, then we can start, dialing in on what we really need to do. I don't know that we've got to worry too much about, what is reality, what does the future really hold for us, because we're not going to pass any budgets unless we review them first, and we're going to slowly over time see what the revenue picture really looks like because of what actually happens out there in terms of development and taxes and things like that. So I just think that these are all good pieces of information, good data points for us to contemplate, but it's the expense budgets will be met easily and the revenue budgets will be more difficult. So that's the takeaway.
I'd like to get a feel too, based on Chris's answer to Julie's question. My opinion is a 12%, being conservative in a budget mid-year, and even if that's, again, it may change. I think that's fairly close, being conservative, that you could almost call it even, if that makes any sense. If we were 40% off or 60% over or whatever, but, you know, I know, as I think everybody else, if we do have more savings, obviously there's plenty of things we can do that our citizens want and expect and whatnot. So, you know, I personally feel fairly comfortable going forward, at least trying to make some kind of, get a bullet point or ballpark of where we go, because, again, I don't think that it's going to change that much, and we can always adjust these numbers if, we can adjust this plan if we track it later and find that it's way off.
I think that we can, you know, look at this, you know, every which way but loose. At some point, we've got to draw a line
Right.
and know that there's going to be maybe something over it or under it, but we got to draw a line and keep moving forward. And, you know, if our savings are 100,000 more or less, in the big picture, does it really matter? You know, we've got to start this thing and keep moving. So I'm comfortable with some of these things that we've. I mean, you've looked at it. I mean, we can change a number every time.
We haven't looked at it every way,
but I mean, many ways. Not to say that there's, you know, that we won't continue to look at it, you know, internally. But I think I'm ready to kind of take the middle road here and keep on trucking.
Help me with the numbers a little bit, because I mean, Chris and I didn't really talk about percentages, but if we're really looking at year-to-date 12-point-something%, if you assume that you were going to be at 10, just to be a little bit conservative through the end of the year, that's $1.6, $1.7 million, is it not?
But I guess, you know, Chris and I talked about it. I mean, it's like your family budget. I mean, you could be tracking along, be doing good, and all of a sudden,
Understand.
blow out in the car, tire, or, you know, engine or something like that. So I don't know that I'd even, you know, try to project that out, that it is definite. 10 to 12%.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I think from a planning standpoint, from the standpoint of what we need to do with the plan, the residential areas are pretty well fixed. The areas where we can support commercial development are pretty well fixed. The question is how much. And so from a planning standpoint, I think it gives us enough to go ahead if we can kind of lock in on the idea that we're going to reserve those two areas, Deerfield and Arnold Mill, as the areas where we would allow commercial growth. And then commercial growth can take place as it needs to, right? Or as it wants to. Terry?
I think we ought to talk about crabapple in that potentially as well, too,
I was gonna bring that up.
which would alleviate some of the Arnold Mill.
Good point. Can we go back a few? If you look here, if you look at crabapple here, and this is the Model A, there's about 82 acres of additional space in crabapple that's converted to low density residential in that model. Now, we do have a model that we talked about last time that has, and I didn't bring it with me, unfortunately. I don't remember how much D had in it. Michelle, do you have D with you?
Not with me, but I can look at it.
If we're interested, the D model that we had was kind of the extreme commercial development, and it did have some portion of that. I don't remember how much that was converted to commercial.
George. Karen.
Oh, sorry, Karen.
Couple things. Number one, we got to look back at what the real purpose of this model is, and it's to make sure that the comprehensive plan that we approve going forward is fiscally viable with
Right.
the information that we have.
Right.
I mean, and it's a plan. It's not going to be exact, but you sure don't want to put something out there that is not fiscally viable. We'd love to live in a dream world, but we can't always do that. Number two, I agree with crabapple. There is some high density that's already been zoned that I really think, from a planning perspective, may be better as commercial rather than high density development. And I think that it would, from a master plan, it might make more sense. I think it's what the people in the area would prefer to have. So I believe instead of having all of the high density in Arnold Mill and Deerfield, we need to look at possibly taking some of what is high density residential in Crabapple and changing it to commercial or office, to make it have a daytime population, business population. Now, I don't know what that does to your plan, because obviously you do that, then you're population-wise, you gotta put that population somewhere else.
Right.
But I really believe that if you just looked at Crabapple itself, and I know Terry and Buck and Bill have been working on some of that, but if you look at it as what's best from a master plan, it wouldn't be what is currently planned or what the future land use plan states it is.
Right.
So I would like to see maybe some of that higher density end up in Crabapple and get rid of some of the commercial end up in Crabapple and get rid of some of the higher density.
Okay.
Couple of questions. One, where are we, so that it's not communicated, because I want to make sure that we communicate this clearly since not everyone's in the room. So that it's communicated that expenses also includes capital improvements. Can you speak to the fact that expenses, projected expenses in our budget also include money that we're setting aside for capital improvements, park acquisition, park
not.
development, in
It does
nothing?
not.
So this is just paying the bills?
Well, it does include the amount that we,
It includes debt service on those things that are gonna roll over, like leases on vehicles and things like that.
Paying the bills.
But just on
And paying the
existing
bills.
stuff.
but does it include the amount that we had set aside last year for roads, with the same amount being set aside going forward?
If it was set aside in a separate capital budget, the answer is no. If it was set aside as a line item in the expense budget, then the answer is yes.
Which was it, Carter?
Well, it's a capital line item.
That would have been the capital projects fund.
Right. Because, I mean, if that's the case, we gotta have at least the 2.4 million going forward, not an additional
I think we
850,000.
talked about that. I think that was captured.
I think it was too. I think Stacy tried to capture it.
I think it.
I thought you guys
we-
captured
we
Yeah, I
had
thought you
talked about
captured the
that.
same amount
But
you
it's
had
not-
in prior
it's
years.
not captured as something separate and distinct. If
Right.
that's something
It's
you
just in
want us
that
to do, we
pie.
can, but I think
It
it's
is in what we
pie.
expect our expenses to be, or based on current year, so
Right.
since,
Right. So I think to answer Alan's question, the question I think you asked, yes, did you ask yes, no question?
no.
Well, I mean, we've got stuff in this year's budget,
Right.
park acquisition, all of that.
Trails, 200,000,
Yeah, all of
land
that.
acquisition, road repaving,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I believe those were captured.
Okay, so we would be figuring the same amount of that type of
That
capital
stuff.
improvements in the future would include in the expense category.
With an escalation.
If it's with an escalation.
Yes,
If it's in
okay.
there, the answer is
Got
yes.
me, okay, thank you. And then the other question is, how are we doing year-to-date on reserves? I knew that as of last year, we were ahead of schedule on
It's
reserves.
fully funded
We
now.
fully funded it.
Fully funded, okay.
With the, and that's not to say that we should maintain just a minimum level of reserve.
Right.
But the good news is that, yes, we met our fully funding projection.
And what is that?
16%?
Okay. And then my last question has to do with how this modeling compares to the modeling that we had. I mean, I know we didn't have a financial model quite like this prior to becoming a city, but we did have some estimates about the financial viability of the city before we became a city. And what I remember is that it wasn't quite like this, because this shows us not paying our bills, and that wasn't quite what was articulated to the voters prior to becoming a city, so I'd like for us to speak to that.
You want to speak to that, or you want me to?
Go right ahead.
This is reality.
Yeah. A couple things. Number one, I think when we got into it, we based our projections on the same level of service we were getting in Fulton County, which means that roads were getting repaved every 50 years. Based on what has been told to us, we need to be on a schedule a little different than that. So the original budget was based strictly on the level of service that we had as residents unincorporated. We also didn't take into account the fact that we were going to be in an economic recession that we currently are, and that property tax revenue would be decreasing. It took into account that it would continue increasing the way it had for the 5 years we became a city. And those are the two biggest things I believe are the differences in this.
And along that same level of service under Fulton County, that's a multitude of things, one of which would have been public safety,
Public
which we know
safety,
was
yes.
way under.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we have a lot better public safety than we could ever dream of under Fulton County.
Let me, two responses, Alan. One, if it is going to be helpful for you guys going forward to try and break out those things that are quote-unquote capital so that we're showing them separately, we can do that. I'm sure Stacy can probably do that so that they're at least visible as a separate line item instead of operating expenses.
Well, I mean, it would be helpful for me. I mean, it would be helpful if we're going to be asked to change the future land use plan to include increased commercial in Deerfield, Arnold Mill, and/or Crabapple. I'd like to know what we're going to get for that, assuming all of that were to be built out.
Okay.
Can you show general fund expenses on your model and you have general fund and capital
Well,
project fund? And then, I mean,
well,
we have.
we can show it as a line item. I mean, it'll be like the staff reduction line item that we put in now. We can add a line item for capital expenditures or one-time expenditures, or whatever you want to call it, that aren't operating expenses.
Okay.
And you may want to escalate that differently. I mean, the operating expenses are being escalated per the assumptions. You may want to make the others more discrete and not escalate them year to year. But anyway, we can do that.
I think we can do that, Alan.
The second thing is, if you really do want to go back and look at the numbers that we put together before the city was formed and where we are now, we can do that as a separate exercise. To me, that's not a function of the comprehensive plan or anything else, but we can certainly do that if you want to do that.
Well, I mean, just keeping in mind that, part of it was the same level of service under Fulton County, and I do realize we're getting a better level of service than we are under Fulton County, regardless of what some people might think. I know we are. But it is keeping in mind that, as Karen pointed out, that we've had an economic recession, one that is unheard of, and we didn't plan for that. However, at some point there'll be an uptick. We don't know when that'll be, but hopefully it'll happen. And I would like for us to, keep this in mind when we look at this model. The only thing is, if we do have this uptick in the economy and property taxes increase to the level they were prior to this recession, if we change our future land use map to include all this extra commercial, then we can't really go back and change it again.
You can't change the future land use map, but you still have control of the zoning.
And you said 5 years and we pay up.
5
Doing
years,
that again?
every 5 years it's going to be revised.
So you're assuming we'll be done within the next 5 years?
Yes.
You know, I do have
He's
a
got his
question.
fingers crossed.
Or not having committed.
Thinking about the balance between where we are with expenses and with capital improvements, and obviously jumping from that to the unknowns of not knowing when the economy's going to turn around, not knowing what our savings potentially are in terms of additional conservative approaches that hopefully will come out of our budgeting cycle, our budgeting discussions, to jump from 6 acres in Arnold Mill to an incremental 133 into a future land use plan and some variation of that in Deerfield as well as in Crabapple, knowing that the landscape could change between now and then. When I hear us say that we could change the future land use plan in 5 years, if we change it this year, the expectation of those landowners is that they have an opportunity for that land to convert. And I don't know that there's any example where the future land use plan calls for commercial in 5 years in any jurisdiction to then say, you know what, we were just kidding, we're gonna now pull it back. So I'd like us to think through the process of moderation. We've all said that this model is an estimating tool, and I don't know that we have enough definitive assumptions. I mean, in any sort of financial model, I don't know how we can say these are definitive enough that we could wrap our arms around it comfortably enough to say, you know what, I'm okay saying that we do need to modify our future land use plan by 127 acres in Arnold Mill, and whatever that would be in Crabapple, and 100 in Highway 9. So part of what I'd like to understand is, how do we use this as a tool, knowing that it's a tool that has imperfections because the assumptions are assumptions. How do we use that without necessarily changing the entire complexion of our community based on assumptions that aren't necessarily grounded in fact? I mean, they're an estimated tool. So is there something that allows us to use this information short-term, understanding that we want to, through a comprehensive land use planning process, modify some of those areas without going to a full 133 or whatever the number is for Deerfield? It just seems to me that there's something
Well,
may be missing in that process.
If I understand the question you're asking, I mean, we can, with limits, model almost anything, but if what you're suggesting is that we not project any commercial development because we don't think it's gonna happen in the next 5 years, and we wanna wait 5 years to do that, the commercial development right now is laid in here linearly. We can take that same amount of commercial development and say, we're not gonna start it for 5 years out, if that's what we wanna do. But I think we have to have at least something that reflects a 20-year horizon of what we think is gonna happen over the next 20 years. 5 years from now, we can change that. But if we believe that we need commercial development in the next 20-year period, to me, it ought to be reflected in the model and it ought to be reflected in the plan. Whether we say we're gonna do it now or say we're gonna do it 5 years from now is a different question.
Yeah, and I'm not saying no development.
No, I understand.
I'm just saying that to go from 6 acres to 133, knowing that we've all just said that the assumptions are just that, they're assumptions. And we don't know how those are going to play out over the course of the next year. It just seems to me that there's some sort of middle ground that allows us not to change that future land use plan so that we set expectations for landowners. Because I do believe that once we have a land use map that says we're going to allow for 130, I'm just going to use that number because that's what was projected, 133 acres in Arnold Mill. If I own land in Arnold Mill, I'm going to start to begin to believe that that's going to be my property right over time. And I think that that becomes a little bit dangerous if we know that we're doing it based on some unknowns, including, are we going to have an additional 1.7 million in savings this year? Are we going to get more conservative and look at our line item budget and hopefully reduce some of our expenses in other areas? So I'm just looking for what are some possible approaches that allow us to, of course, plan for the future, plan for that continued unfortunate economy, but also maintaining some of the citizen expectations of moderation.
Well, Terry's first, sorry.
We could look at a 10-year plan, which would be an intermediate step, that would carry us a little beyond the 5-year plan, that we could determine the amount of acreages we may need to meet that 10-year plan. So it'd give you that stepped approach that you're talking about, where maybe you didn't open the full gates for 20 years, so and it'd give you time to adjust accordingly more incrementally. I think it'd be kind of dangerous to look on at only a 5-year plan.
I've got a question, legal question.
Hang on a minute here. Joe was next.
No, I was gonna, the way I look at it, it's just like in my business every day. You have to make a budget. And sometimes you gotta start, and you gotta start with a reasonable budget. And some line items, you just basically wing it, or use educated guess for it. And then as you move forward, you get more details and you firm it up. And some usually go down, some go up. You usually end up really, really close to your original budget. And the way I see this is we've got to just kind of pick a budget. We can always adjust it a little bit. You can plug in some different numbers or whatever as we firm it up. But, my question was going to be, George, what do you guys need from us to move forward?
Well, again, I don't want to speak for the group, but I think that if we accept the growth assumptions, and if we say that we're going to have 44,000 people in 20 years out, our collective belief is that in order to sustain that, we need to have commercial growth beyond where we are now. The question is how much and where do you want to put it? The how much is, from a modeling standpoint, the how much is driven by the revenue expense equation. The where you want to put it is really the planning question that we need to address. And to Julie's point, I'm not suggesting that we put it somewhere where we don't ultimately want it. But again, to me, putting it on a map that's a 20-year horizon and saying it's going to happen in the next 5 years are two different things. I don't think anybody believes it's going to happen in the next 5 years. If you want to say, hey, our belief is that it's not going to happen in the next 5 years, but in a 20-year plan it's going to happen out there in the future, we don't have to put it on the future land use map now. We can put it on the future land use map at a point in time in the future. But the plan itself has got to address, to me, to Joe's point, it's got to address the assumption that we are going to need additional commercial in the city in order to support 40,000 people 20 years out.
I've got a legal question. It seems like the concern here is if you show something on a plan as commercial 20 years from now, you have no choice but for it to be commercial 20 years from now. Is that the case? Are we better off not showing as much and then knowing that we may have to add to it? Or is if it's shown as possible commercial on the plan, could it go back and be changed at a later time?
Well, the answer to the last question is easy. Yes, it can be
Until
changed.
it's been zoned, it can be
It can be
changed.
changed at a later time. I will certainly say to you that, a lot of property owners will view the land use map with an expectation that if they come in for zoning, that will be a factor to weigh in getting that zoning. But the council doesn't have to give a zoning based upon the land use map. Certainly I've seen many jurisdictions acting in contravention of their land use map. Happens all the time. And they can be sustained acting in contravention of their land use map. But yes, until it's zoned, it can be changed.
Can it be shown on a land use plan not as just what is currently commercial, but as maybe future, so that it's a different color, so that it doesn't automatically look like it's a rubber stamp for commercial?
Yeah, but if we haven't learned anything else in the last couple of months, saying that it's gonna be residential is almost just as bad as saying is it gonna be commercial. I mean, we're in a no-win situation there if we're worried about how it's gonna change in the future. I mean, we can't, it's hard to do that.
Maybe just a subset of that, and I think if we all go back in time, where many people around this table and in this room dealt with Fulton County and all the zoning issues that we've been a party to, legally, the two things that typically are a basis for decision making, what does the future land use plan say, and what's been the policy of that area? And so to your point, and of course you're our attorney, and you know the law better than anybody, is that a component of that zoning process has always been, and I think will continue to be, what does the land use plan say? So I think that we also have to be realistic enough to say that putting on a land use map does step up not only the expectation of the citizen, but I think it steps up the legal expectation. Doesn't mean you can't change it, but once you say that this is a future land use plan that has this as a potentially zoned area, knowing that those are two things that folks usually come forward with the rezoning, I think that there is a greater propensity that that's going to happen. I like the idea that Terry mentioned, which was, yes, of course we want to anticipate and plan for 20 years out, that's what we're doing, but we also know that assumptions get much more difficult to predict the further out in time you go. And so it would seem that maybe there's a balance whereby we say, yeah, we're planning for 20 years, but knowing that we're in an unknown environment, is there a way to look at what that future land use map would look like in a shorter horizon, not 5, but maybe closer to 10. And maybe it's a stair-step sort of approach that says, if there's going to be commercial in those areas beyond that 10-year, well, does it still make sense to be in Arnold Mill, maybe in Crabapple, maybe in Deerfield? Well, sure. I mean, those are general areas, but I think there's something prior to saying that the whole area is going to incorporate 133 and whatever those others would be. It just seems that there's a tiered approach that we might be able to utilize that mitigates the risks, but also allows us to plan appropriately for some of those unknowns.
Lynn, is there any reason from a DCA or ARC standpoint that we couldn't have 2 future land use plans, one for the first 10 years, one for the second 10 years?
No. I would caveat, though, however, that statement with, I have seen in other jurisdictions, even in Georgia, where as a policy decision, the council would approve what I would consider benchmarks. They would establish 5-year, 10-year, 20-year benchmarks, 15-year benchmark, incremental benchmarks, saying this is where we anticipate that we'll be within this 5 years in population growth, in commercial growth, etc. I haven't seen anyone necessarily deny because of those benchmarks, so I'm going to leave that to Ken. But I've seen them establish those so that you can kind of judge as you're putting together your rezonings and putting together your staff reports, and the Planning Commission is making their recommendations, whether or not you're getting way out ahead of your comp plan or you're lagging behind a little bit due to economy or due to other factors that just may keep us growing a little bit more slowly than what we had anticipated. I think maybe better than using a 2 or 3 different sets of future land use plans themselves, establishing those benchmarks. And that really is a policy decision from you all. I mean, we'll make recommendations, but that's a policy decision that you all as a council are going to have to set. I think that's probably a better way to go about establishing kind of markers to let you know where you are in your comp plan.
But let's come back to Joe's question, what do we need? I mean, the reality is, in spite of everything we've said and everything that everybody wants, to me, what this model is showing us as a tool is that whether we look at 5 or 10, we've got an issue with being able to balance expenses and revenues without adding commercial. It may not be what everybody wants, but the reality, if you accept what the model's telling us, is that we do need to add commercial to some extent in the next 5 years in order to be able to make revenues meet expenses. Or we have to reduce expenses to meet revenues, whichever way we want to do it. There's been no effort made here to reduce expenses to meet revenues. It's been the other way around. But if we're going to have a model where the revenues meet or exceed expenses in the next 5 years, none of these models will do that unless we add commercial.
Bill, thank you.
Typically, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, and knowing what I see and do and hear out in the commercial arena here, I would tend to err on the side of pessimism and in projecting any retail, knowing full well that we need to add it. I'm on board with Terry's recommendation that we take a shorter term look at commercial development out there. My gut feeling, it's just my gut feeling, I think we're going to see a dramatic change in retail development going forward. And I think some of it's, I think a large part of it is driven by the internet. Having said that,
Dramatic change, define dramatic change, in which direction?
I think you're going to see a decrease in commercial retail development going forward. I think numbers indicate already the impact of internet commerce out there and how it's affected retail in place. Does that paint a bleak picture for us? It may.
No,
This commercial is all commercial, it's
includes this.
Oh, I understand.
office, yeah.
office, hotel, retail, anything commercial oriented.
Anything non-residential.
Non-residential, so it could be warehouse, it could be industrial, it can be whatever beyond residential.
So it's industrial too, M1, M2?
Could be. We're not saying.
We're not creating any new
We're
zoning.
not
or
just
anything.
saying.
You're just saying it's non-residential.
And what's wrong with Virginia Rose?
Well, if what Bill is saying is going to happen, and I trust his judgment because he's got his
It's just my opinion.
well, you got your hand on the pulse of the industry. I guess what I'm having a hard time coming to grips with is the fact that we still have 2 million square feet of commercial in our current land use plan. And I don't really see how, if what you're saying is true, how adding more commercial in Arnold Mill or any other place for that matter is going to change anything. And in fact, it could make it worse from a purely development standpoint, in that if we go ahead in our land use plan and say, okay, Arnold Mill is going to be commercial, parts of it are going to be commercial, and somebody comes in right away and rezones. So now you've got commercial right in the middle of all the agriculture out there. And then at some point later, we come back and reassess it. Not only have we already said that that would be commercial, but now you've got commercial in the middle of agricultural, AG1, and that is just piss poor development to be developing, residential, commercial, AG1, all there right there together without any vision, I guess.
Don't forget, though, that, and I think we've talked about this before, that with respect to Arnold Mill, with respect to Crabapple, with respect to Highway 9, one of the things that we are recommending as part of the plan is each of those areas needs to be independently master planned, so that, to your point, we're not suggesting that the first guy in is going to put something in there. We're going to have a master plan that has to be done before any of that happens. So that where that goes and how it goes in there would be consistent with a longer-term view of how that would be developed.
Can I go back too? We have charged George, your committee, and CPAC with doing a future land use plan for us. We've also charged you guys, or you guys are doing the financial model. And I agree with everybody's points. We've got a lot of different points, and I agree, there may be some changes in budget. We may need to tighten some things up. We may, there's some unknowns. There's some unknowns with the economy and all this. But at some point, I feel like we just running you guys around, and you can't really, do your job. So that's kind of where my question is, and sure, open it to Chris, to Ken, to Lynn. I think we just need some general advice, and we're going to have to hit it somewhere down the middle in a reasonable way, and at least allow you to move forward so we can see what the plan looks like. Before we adopt the plan, we can tweak it, we can look at it and say, no, we're going the wrong direction. But I feel like we've got to give you guys a little bit of lead to go and move forward. So if that makes any sense.
Yep.
It does, Joe. I mean, from the standpoint of CPAC's been modeling several different ways to look at this. We've been using several different budget plans. We've been using several different land use plans to come to this closure. You've had community input. You've had hearings on of your own discussion. At some point, you can't necessarily have CPAC say to you, "Here's the model, here's the budget." You guys have to say, "Here's the budget," and then which of the models best fits the budget. So, at some point, there has to be a meeting where CPAC says, "Okay, we're done. We've done all the modeling we can do for you," and you guys have to say, "Okay, we've got a budget we think is a pretty good one," and you see if the two match. And then from that comes the end result, which is the land use plan. But at some point, CPAC's going to need you guys to make a couple of decisions.
That's what I'm trying to get.
So do we have a model that we think meets our needs?
Well, based
Yeah.
on the notes that I took, we've got three options that have revenue at least staying ahead of expenses until 2016, which I think is the critical point, because since we're going to reevaluate this in 5 years, that gives us a year leeway to make some adjustments, and we don't have to have our heads stuck in a hole until then. We're going to know what's going on between now and then. And again, a plan doesn't dictate anything to us other than give us some general guidelines on what may be in the future. So, so I think that, and I think I got both the model future land use plan 2.3 with the savings, the Model A and the Model A adjusted all had revenue staying ahead of expenses at least through 2016. So, I mean, I think that we've gotten out of CPAC what we need in terms of this. There's lots more work to do, that obviously on both sides, but I think this at least answers the questions that I had last time.
So you're advocating the model that was current land use plan with 2.3 million in savings for staff transition model?
No, what I said was we have three models
Uh-huh.
that we need to discuss in greater detail. Obviously, we don't vote on anything right now, but we've got three options that keep revenue ahead of expenses, which are the key elements to publishing a plan that makes any sense. So, so if we have those options, I think that that we're in somewhat good shape.
And the first option is the one that shows we actually have a 2.3.
Right. I think the reason that I would probably, if I had to favor something right now, favor that one is because it gives us some flexibility.
I don't think I could favor that one because it shows us our public works and roads going backwards. It shows us actually getting further behind each year in our infrastructure.
Well, the plan doesn't show us going backwards. The plan may
The
show how
expense
much
amount.
money that we're spending, not keeping up with the right pace, but that's a little different than going backwards.
Well, it shows our infrastructure is getting worse each year, based on that. Because we're not meeting what we have to get to a maintained standpoint with the infrastructure.
That's where I almost think, we need a simple, and I don't know, staff can weigh in or whatever, but and it may be tough to do, but, we do need to pick a direction. And
I'll be honest with you, I think let's kind of build it from the
Maybe
ground up.
George can kind of help.
From our standpoint, I think the thing that would be the most helpful, to Joe's point, is out of the three you mentioned, the big difference is that in one case, we're starting with the current future land use plan, and the other case, we're starting with the way things are currently zoned. That would be helpful as to which of those is the right place to start, because it makes a significant difference in terms of what, both for us and for you ultimately, because if you start with the current future land use plan, there's built into there inherently a huge amount of rezoning that you're assuming. If you start with the current zoning plan, then to Julie's point, everything that comes before you as a land use plan is going to be consistent with the zoning plan, so that you don't have this dichotomy of land use plan saying one thing, zoning plan saying something else, and you guys have to decide which one you want to go with. I mean, personally, I think, and that's, quite honestly, that's one of the reasons that we didn't go that way in the first place, is because we thought it would be more easier to administer, shall we say, if we started with the way everything is currently zoned and then only looked at rezoning what we needed to from there.
Incrementally. In other words, going from, you're not suggesting them going from 6 to 133, you're suggesting something that really starts to be closer to what Terry was.
Well, yeah, we'd look at the curve and the model, and we would say 10 years out, I need
X.
400,000 square feet or whatever in order to make the number.
If the assumptions
So
are.
the assumptions are valid, and that's going to equate to X amount of acres. And so on the land use plan, the current land use plan, the 20-year plan we're putting in, you really do kind of a 10-year plan, because in 5 years, you're going to be able to go back and adjust that. So you haven't let the barn door completely open.
Yeah, I would be a proponent of really looking at it incrementally, because I don't think there's any way that everybody in this room and folks that aren't in this room can feel confident that the assumptions have, 80 or 90% success of being correct, and you have that many different variations. I mean, how many different variables are in that model? 10 to 20, I mean, a bunch. So even if a few are off,
monster ball.
I mean, it's just a huge one. And I'm just hesitant to say, yes, we should adjust our future land use plan to the full extent, knowing that some of those variables may or may not come to fruition. I'd like to also ask this question, because, and to everybody's point, yeah, at some point we've got to say that this is kind of the point in the sand. But knowing, Chris, that we hopefully will be looking for some additional expense savings, I mean, I'd like to think that we're not done with sharpening that pencil with regards to the budget. And while, yes, we've got a budget, I think we need to go back in and look on a line item basis to see, are there some additional places that, and I know that you guys do that daily.
Daily.
But we as a group maybe can look and say, are there some additional places we can reprioritize? And think about saving some additional dollars. And I don't know that we have to go 100% with where we are with our transportation plan recommendations. I mean, again, some of those recommendations are best case scenario, you want to fund 100% of that, but if we know that we're in an economy that's questionable, maybe we have to say that we can't fund 100% of it this year, that we have to be a little bit more conservative. And I just don't know that we've done that yet.
Well, I think the point is, to Julie's point, yeah, we may, but if you compare with George's point, we're looking 20 years out too. So we are gonna, yeah, we may have some dips, and we may, have to spend twice as much one year, half one year or whatever. But I just feel like, we've got to get these guys a direction to go, because it's almost the chicken or the egg. Is the future plan driving this model? Is this model driving the future plan? Are you at a comfort level with knowing what everything you've done up to now to kind of see a trend of where you think the future plan is going to be, so that you can adjust the model to it, or where do we go from here?
Lynn could weigh in on this. I mean, I think historically these plans have been done in a vacuum, right? And there's not been any discrete connection between the comprehensive plan and the financial plan for the city or whatever the entity is. And so coupling those does create a lot of the chicken and the egg kind of a syndrome. We can do a plan in a vacuum and say, here it is, and then leave it to you guys to figure out how to make it work. I guess what we're just trying to lift up is that right now there's enough issues, and it's close enough that we think that it's worth investing the time to try and make sure we've got something on paper that works so that we're actually got something we're gonna work against and try and use instead of just putting on the shelf.
Does your committee have, a recommendation, which model to use?
I don't want to speak for the committee, Joe. We really haven't had the opportunity to talk about that. I mean, I do believe, and again, there's enough of us here, but I do believe that we would support going from current zoning instead of from current future land use. Only because, again, I think it creates a better platform to come off of. That's one of the reasons we didn't do that in the first place. Beyond that, I mean, I think we can go back. If you guys can tell us where you want us to lock in from a planning standpoint on this expense issue, we can go back and put together a model that takes those two pieces and puts together our recommendation.
I mean, going from the current plan would be more conservative, correct?
Going from the current zoning.
So current zoning plan, then, so I guess we need to really just kind of focus in on a number range of where we'll go. I mean, Lynn, do you have any, does that make sense?
Yes, and I would just stress that the entirety of the comprehensive plan is really a policy document. This is a tool. This is not, tied into stone forever and always. We do have to revisit it every 5 years. As a tool, we can put in there a lot of other variables that we wouldn't necessarily be able to put into an ordinance and make have the force of law. So, as a policy tool, again, this is your document. But I think that the committee has come up with some good alternatives. They originally did recommend Model A. That was without, of course, the changes to the cost savings amount. So I would ask that, they have the ability to go back and look at that again. But if you would give us some direction, that would be very, very helpful.
Ken, you wanted to?
I think it's safe to say we all like the same ones that Joe likes, where the revenue line is above the and we spent a lot of time over at Terry's room playing with all the variables to try to make those work and making assumptions to try to make the lines, the red line on the right side of the green dotted line. So I think it's safe to say that you can throw out the three that the numbers don't work and focus on the three that the numbers do work, and then if we can get some guidance from you as to which of those assumptions are the safest ones to go with, it'll be easy to make, a good recommendation.
Ken, you were going to say
That leads
something?
into exactly what.
Yeah, this is what Chris and I were chatting about, and I want to follow, kind of bootstrapping on what Lynn said. I agree with George, first of all, that in a lot of the jurisdictions I work in, I never see the financial data put into this decision making, and which is, it's neat. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's very necessary. But it also, I want to reinforce to you that this is a planning tool, and I don't know necessarily that you want, because George is also right. These are just numbers on a piece of paper. And I've been in a lot of planning in the last 5 years that has gone south because no one saw this economy the way it was going to go, and all those numbers, you just throw them up and throw them away. And my only point to you is let this tool from a land use policy standpoint be controlled by those considerations of how you want Milton to look. And then you juxtapose on top of that perhaps the financial model, and certainly you want it to make sense within the options that show you in the black. I get that. But for goodness sakes, let the good sound land use policy, I think, be the thing that you really focus on, because there are all kinds of tools that local governments have to be flexible to new opportunities that may come to you, that you need to do something like overlays or intergovernmental agreements, or all kinds of things you can do if you've got a real winning project that we need to be flexible on. But I'm sensing the council's getting a little bit bogged down into perhaps letting the budget totally control the map, and I'm just saying, look, let your rely on Lynn and Chris and your planners, and maybe budget be a little bit more secondary. And that may be out of line, but that's just one thing I see y'all are really struggling with.
And I totally agree, because I think this is this is a tool, and this is a projection, and I think we can use this. It doesn't mean that we have to drive our city and our future plan based on this tool. I think the thing about this tool, though, is something we can go back and look at and trend and see, 3 years from now, 2 years, look, we're not doing this, or this isn't developing like we thought or like the plan is, so we need to adjust our expenses accordingly or whatever. But, I totally agree. I think we need to give this board some direction to do their plan, but to do their financial model, but then also as they work on the plan, the two don't have to be totally, but it's kind of a check and balance system. So, but, again, how do we leave?
Well,
How do we leave?
we're not gonna take
They-
this is so great.
Sounds
This is
good.
so much a policy
We all want to
issue.
agree.
You're not doing anything illegal today.
Yeah.
This
Well,
is
it's a discussion.
And I guess it brings me back to Terry's suggestion about this 10-year plan, because the model would look different if we were saying, where are we gonna be if we look from now until that 10th year, versus having to be in the black 20 years from now, given that a lot of these variables 20 years out are gonna be significantly different. To Joe's point, both Joe's point, we'll be looking at this hopefully on a regular basis. My caution is just that the future land use plan not be dictated by the model that right now is predicated on variables that are candidly unknowns. Because that future land use plan does change the complexion of this community. Is the complexion of the community going to change to a certain extent? Of course it is. However, I just think that there's got to be something between all and nothing. And so I guess my request back to CPAC would be, how do you perhaps take what Terry was suggesting and what you talked about, how do you take a stair-step approach? I'm with Joe from the perspective of being conservative on the expense side and not presuming that we're going to expend a larger portion of that 2.3 million. Candidly, I think we need to go back to our budget and see where else we can save some more money. I don't think we've done enough of that, and I think we need to. And I think looking at these numbers says to me we shouldn't be just jumping out and saying, well, where do we put more commercial? I think at the same time we need to be saying, what do we do to trim our budget? And I think we all need to look long and hard about those line items and figure out what are we going to do to save some more money. And to George's earlier point, this model presumes, and I wrote it down, it presumes nothing about additional cost savings. I think we have to look long and hard about what we're going to do to save some more money for the city. In addition, we've talked about other revenue generating opportunities, et cetera. But if the commercial market, to Bill's point, continues to demonstrate that you're not going to have as many storefronts, that leads us back, I think, to how do we trim that budget even more. So is there one simple answer tonight that says you guys go off and we have a final answer? I don't think so. I guess what I hear is that there's maybe a way to do a stair-step approach, that we need some more updates from Stacy regarding the financials. Yes, this year, but to get a better sense of maybe where we can further trim the expenses. Because there's no question that what we put in terms of cost savings and or expenditures is immediately driving the end result of this model. And especially it becomes, that much more significant because it's 20 years out versus just 10.
I'll just have to say that, and then, sorry, Jerry, as far as the budget and looking for cost savings, I'm certainly all for that and want to be very conservative, but if you sit in my chair every day and hear all the things and dealing with staff and citizens and all that we need to do and that we're so far behind on, I agree, we need to come up with every savings, every dollar we can, but there are things that, we don't have budgeted for that we really need to be doing. So I think we're so close. When I say, Chris said the number 12%, whether that's accurate or, it's still pretty close. We're not so far off the budget. So, and again, it's a 20-year thing. We may, to your point, Julie, and Bill's point about commercial, going down the next few years, whatever it may, and we may have to adjust things accordingly. But that's, again, part of the plan. So I think we need to hit the middle of the road, reasonable plan, use that as a tool and adjust it accordingly as we move forward. But,
Just one other comment that I want to make. While we're all concerned about the impact of commercial, probably the bigger threat is the AG1 subdivision allowance. Will have probably the bigger impact if you look at our central Milton area where we've got
2,300 acres.
2,300 acres that right now allows a subdivision to be built without any rezoning in AG1. And that has a far greater impact on this community than any amount of commercial we've talked about tonight.
Just a couple last things. Number one is, I think the 10-year plan is a good idea, because I think it's, you can estimate 10 years in the future. When you start trying to guess what's going to happen 20 years in the future, I mean, it's a guess. Guess population-wise, it's a guess a lot of things. Number two, I agree with the mayor. There's an awful lot of things that aren't even taken into account that could be expenditures, like parks we haven't even started with, and the bike and pedestrian pathway, and a lot of other costs that we haven't even figured into this as our baseline cost. I feel strongly, and maybe it's the accountant hat, that you can't have a plan that shows expenses are going to be greater than your revenues, regardless. So, you either got to change your assumptions or something, or make the plan work. Now, I feel strongly that everything ought to be master planned. We shouldn't be just letting anybody get anything zoned just because it looks a certain way on a future land use plan. In fact, until we get a master plan in place for places like Arnold Mill, I'd love to see a moratorium. And, and like I said, I've talked to Roswell about the possibility of us doing a joint plan along Arnold Mill, because I believe that is critical. And I really don't want to see anything developed until it can be developed the way it needs to. And that's one area that we have actually a clean slate. And we don't have to work around a lot of things. But I do feel like we can't put a plan in place that that shows us getting further behind in our infrastructure, which if we continued on with just the amount we currently have in it, we're getting further behind, and it will actually end up costing us more in the long run. I feel like we've got to have at least that in there, and then hopefully we can have some expense savings, and those expense savings can go to some of the things that we'd really like to do, like the parks, and we can not have uncontrolled development, but actually have it where it makes sense in a master plan for Deerfield, Arnold Mill, and Crabapple. I would like to know how much of that 2 million square feet that is currently slated for commercial, where exactly that is, how much of it is in, I agree with Bill. Retail, if you look at what other countries do, our percentage of retail square footage per person is so off the chart of any other country in the world that we don't need a whole lot more retail if you look at it. So any commercial we're going to have is probably going to be more office or things like that. But I'd like to know where that 2 million square feet is going to go that we've already got currently planned.
And I think that's a big nut to swallow.
Yeah,
when you hear
that's a lot.
Or even when somebody mentioned averaging it out 100,000 a year. That's hard to comprehend really in Milton, I think. So, but that's a good point. But again, in the whole incremental, like Terry said, maybe, as Lynn said, maybe you put benchmarks, at the 10-year, and that we know then 10 to 20, 10 to 15, and then 15 to 20 is obviously more of a lag than the first.
Because if the population slows down, we don't need it near as quick. So, that's one variable that if it changes, it changes everything. Sure.
I'm just not, I don't know if I know what the right answer is, and I know we've been talking about this for an hour and a half, so I want to kind of get some direction. Everybody's got great ideas, but, I need somebody that's educated on this to get up and say, here's what you need to do.
Well, let me ask a question. What's the consensus of the council with respect to starting with a land use plan or starting with the zoning map?
I think I'd prefer to start with the zoning map, which is more conservative.
I would probably agree with that too, being more realistic.
Well, we have a zoning map.
Yes,
The future land use plan is something in the future, so.
Exactly right.
That was decided by somebody else.
Anybody else?
Seems like a waste of 2 years, doesn't it? If we go to zoning map rather than land use map.
Well, I mean, as a starting point.
Yeah.
This is a starting point.
And George, maybe clarify that again. So starting with what's currently zoned on the ground, giving no, it would go to the highway non-area. It's a good example where you have some things that are zoned C1. Obviously, we've had a case before us recently that's in the future land use plan, it shows it as C1, and yet currently it's AG1. So in that instance, under the current zoning plan that you're suggesting, or that CPAC's suggesting, that parcel may or may not be shown as C1.
Correct.
I mean, I just want to make sure that I'm,
Am I correct that this financial model can be changed?
Oh,
Let's say
absolutely.
we base this on the current zoning plan, and to Bill's point, not to waste 2 years, when we have our future plan, it may be a little bit different, and then you guys could come back and change the numbers in the financial model and,
No, somebody else can do that.
okay. But that's my point. You know, I don't want, it's like, I think we're sitting here worried that this financial plan is gonna drive the whole, you know, the dog.
I mean,
It's
Ken
just the
said it
tail.
right, it's gotta be the other way
Yeah.
around. The plan's gotta drive the model instead of the other way around.
So if we go with it using the current zonings, then that takes your 3 that show
Down to two.
down to the A and adjusted A.
Well,
Kinda-
or we can go back to the ones that we talked about last time. I mean, I think what I'm getting, again, the other piece we need in order to decide which model works the best is what do you want us to assume? Knowing it's not gonna be right, knowing it's not gonna be exact, what do you want us to assume for savings, regardless of which line item it goes into? We got a kind of a bracket of 2.3 down to 0. Where do you want us to be on that scale as a starting point?
I mean, I'd just say that I would rather be on the higher side just because, to be conservative, and I know that, you know, not to count our chickens before they hatch, so to speak, with the savings, so, you know, that's my opinion, but.
I would say the 2.3 plus whatever we need to get us to our infrastructure plan each time. So what was that, 830,000? So it'd be 2.3 minus 850,000? Was 850,000 the difference?
I don't know that, no, because
So
that
it's
2.3
1.2.
is contemplated over 2 years. It's contemplated at 1.3 and 1.
Okay.
And we are, if we try to bring the $1.4 million funding and pavement management to 2.25 in this fiscal year, we are short the difference between 2.25 and 1.4
Okay.
in the first year.
That's 850.
So that's 850, so it would be
Right.
850 in both years.
Well, no, because the 850, once it's in the base model year, then it would continue on for 850 that next year. So I think
It
we're okay.
would if you get it into the first, George, is that the way that
Well,
works?
It may just be the math, the way the math
Yeah.
works out, but that 1.7 over the first 2 years against the 2.3 is what gets you back to 600,000.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure we got a plan for pavement. I want to make sure we're on that plan, but then all the rest of the savings, let's,
and that's part of like, I know Carter's here.
no, part of left.
She just-
Yeah.
That was good timing.
All right, so I think, go ahead.
I
We'll
was
wait
just
for
going to say,
Carter.
with regards to the paving, you know, is there something that allows us, obviously, not to fund 100% of that and still keep up to a certain extent? I mean, again, and I know that we want better service in Fulton County, but I do think that as an environment, we can't necessarily presume that we're going to fund 100% of it every year. We don't want to get behind, I understand that.
You know, the only thing I'd say about that, of course, we always have the option to not fund a certain amount. If we find that, you know, we're having some issues or whatever, we can always go back and do that. But I don't know about you guys, but everywhere I drive in Milton and places that aren't on the, you know, even in the next few years, when the roads are bad. And, you know, we could save $10 million a year, it still takes a while to catch up. So, you know, I want to be as conservative as we can.
It's one of the few items that I can actually point to a plan that we have adopted as a city, where there's a recommendation from the people that we paid a lot of money to, who are experts in the field, to make a recommendation. Which is why in all future, I kind of use that now as my marching orders for the budget, to know that this is what it said over the next 10 years to get us to an average PCI 70. That was what we asked them to do. That's the funding that needs to be there to do that. And to not do that doesn't necessarily mean our roads fall apart. Carter could probably speak to this now that he walked back in better than I can. I'm just throwing you out there. But there will be that point too, which I don't know how we tweak the plan. That let's say we take a 10-year plan and we say let's go 14 years on the plan. Okay, that's great, but does that mean we take the costs that were identified over the 10 years and just now divide by 14? I don't know that we necessarily do that, because then we have to look at the roads and figure out, okay, which ones, if we would have paved them on time, cost us $12 a square foot, now cost us $26. Because it's a totally different treatment that, you know, by holding off on a year might save us in the budget, but we might actually pay twice for what the repair is.
But But Chris, I want to make one point. I think we've doubled something here though. Because if we take off if in the first year, instead of saving 1.3, we add that 850 back. That gets us to 2.4 in that initial year for the
2.25.
2.25 in the initial year for the paving. Well, going forward, we still have that 2.25 in there. We don't need to subtract off another 850. It's carried forward. So really, if we can get it right the first year, we don't have to subtract. The next year, we can have that $1 million savings. The first year, we may only have to have, $450,000 savings, but the next year we'll have $1 million savings because we'll have that full 2.4 in the budget, which carries forward. So I think we've doubled that 850 when we don't need to. Yep.
Okay, well, I think we were, sorry, Joe, I think we were getting,
What works, the way to, okay.
we were moving a
that's the way
little
it works.
forward.
You gotta look at the first 2 years. If you're trying to spend $850 a year for the first 2 years, that's $1.7 million.
What you're doing is trying to get your initial budget amount to be the 2.25. And the initial budget right now is the 1.4. You add 850 for the first year to it, so your initial budget for the first year is a 2.25.
But you're gonna spend
it's
another,
gonna-
but you're gonna spend another $850 the second year
The
on
second
top,
year
on
you go-
top of what's in there now.
No, because now what's in there now is a 2.25.
No, you're changing the way the model's being used, right? Right now, the line items that are in there are not being changed. All we're doing is taking it off the bottom as an incremental reduction. So if you want to say that you're going to save or spend $850 out of the original 1.3, then you're going to have $550 in the first year, and then if you want to spend $850 out of the $1 million in the second year, you're going to have $150 in the second year, and then that will carry forward. The sum of those two will carry forward. So you're going to get the $550 the first year, $550 the second year, but it's going to carry forward after that. I think we're saying the same thing. If you want to put those up in the line items, then you're not going to take them off the bottom.
And what I'm saying is, you don't need to take them off.
Correct.
Let's make sure.
The only way we've been able to take these off is a line,
Yeah.
a specific line item, because we can't get into the code.
Oh, you can't get into code to change the beginning
Yeah,
All
number.
we can do is take it off the bottom
Get in
line.
the code.
We can't get into the code
Oh,
on it.
that's a challenge.
There you go.
So we can't change what our starting number is. All we can do is
Back
adjust
off.
this bottom.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, I guess where we need to continue talking about concept, but direction, but, as far as going into paving and we could sit here all night and talk about paving and the cost of police cars and this and that, but all that is budgeted. And again, it's as good as a budget can be, and that's what it is, so.
I mean, the discussion
I
you
think-
guys are having is the annual budget
Yeah,
discussion.
yeah, I think
It's
we're
not-
getting more into, we're talking about this financial model. So right now, I think about 4 or 5 of us, we start with Bert, we were talking about starting with using the existing zoning map as your tool to start with.
Got it.
Okay, is that pretty much, okay, so we got that point. Now, the next question is, how much savings do we allow to
Just
build?
from an assumption.
Yeah, from an assumption,
Doesn't matter how you
because
spend it.
next year, we'll look at it and, maybe we've got more, maybe we've got less, and we'll adjust it there.
This
I
is
think-
just net savings.
And I'm a little confused, on the exact numbers as we talk about them, so, what are our options?
Well, there was the
There
zero savings
the
option,
zero,
the 600K option, or
600.
the 2.4 savings option, and the 600K
0,
option.
6, and 2.3 are the three that we looked
Yeah.
at.
Okay,
I'd say take the middle ground, because
but is 6 the middle ground, or?
Yeah, but we're
I-
bringing up with
0 to
six
2
doesn't
point.
seem like-
Sorry?
I guess my question would be, is there something that's less than 2.3 or more than 600,000?
Lots more than
Yeah.
that.
But yeah, 0 to 2.3.
But I mean, there's like
50%.
Yeah, I think even using.
I was trying to use a plan they've already got in place,
Yeah.
so
That's easy, that's easy.
That's the easy one.
But
Well,
just,
you're-
let me say
But
this,
my point is, the difference between 600 and 800, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's not driving the budget. I mean, we're not gonna make changes based on that. We're just getting a general idea of where we're going.
yeah, but I'm just saying, we're talking about 600 to 800 more that we need to fund even just for use, infrastructure or pavement management as one example, that can eat that up. So, I'm personally want to be further to 2.3, 2.4 than 0. So is that number 1.3? Is it, the 600, 900, what, that's where we kind of need to, that's where we need to go right now,
I thought the 600 would be more in line with what.
With the zero.
With the, yeah, would be more in line with fully funding the transportation
Okay.
plan.
Yes.
Well, that's why I said 6 or 800, basically.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, even if we fund the transportation plan, there's still a lot of things, we as a council want to do, parks.
Yeah,
Parks
so
and
you're
Rec
saying
are-
go more on the zero, yeah.
So I'm saying go more, count, or,
I could go with 0 or 600, I can't go with 2.3.
okay, well, maybe I'm
Yeah.
mixed up. You know what, I am.
I'm with
But I'm
you.
saying the opposite. I'd say closer to 0.
Yeah.
Right.
Meaning we
That's
have
what you meant.
more of a, if you want to call it a slush fund or whatever, to improve our city.
He didn't say
I don't call it slush fund, by the way. What he said was. He's right there. Oh, let's say being conservative. Let's just be conservative for so rainy day fund.
Jonathan,
I will say that separate, one thing to consider is, obviously, this model doesn't contemplate those other revenue sources, when it comes to parks and rec, we talked about, do we look at in our survey, obviously, is asking our citizens, do they want us to potentially look at doing a bond referendum, or doing something that's a low-cost mechanism for acquiring additional land, so I don't think we have to assume that we would expend, some of these dollars for that, because there's other opportunities out there, so I don't think it's an all or nothing. So I would just ask us to obviously be mindful that there's other mechanisms out there for those other things that obviously are important to all of us. But it gets back to, are we going to allow all these unknowns to drive a future land use plan that is?
Which I don't think, I don't
Well, and I don't think that's unknown because we have a pavement plan that shows
think.
that.
I would struggle
An
with
approach.
0, saying that we're going to expend all of those dollars.
Okay, so
especially if
we're,
we've got some revenue.
our options are 0 to 2.3, 2.4, 0 being the more conservative. So kind of let's just open that up to,
0 is not more conservative.
It's not more
Okay.
conservative.
It's more
assuming that we're
aggressive.
we're spending all the money.
2.3 would be conservative.
okay, because that's where I
No.
started out for.
No,
then
0,
that's where I'm
because
getting.
it's a minus 2.3, which is more
What if
aggressive
we
than
just
a
say
0, which is
conservative
more
or aggressive?
conservative.
How about that? And let's move
The
on.
model that uses 0 assumes that all the savings go in the pocket.
Spend,
You don't spend
right.
any of it.
I'm because that's,
Yeah.
first I was saying the higher number, and then with Karen talking, I said,
I
well,
think
maybe
you're
I
going
need
with
the
a 0.
How about the middle?
What I'm going is, I know in my own personal financial situation or business, if you count on savings, you may be tracking them, but if you count on them, there's always going to be something that jumps out at you later that you got to spend those savings. So, I'm trying to be conservative and not. So, which number am I looking for?
Well, we do have a
But you
16%
made
What I'm saying is, if we save $1 million, I don't want to necessarily take that out of our budget. I'd rather have some in reserve. So
Let me ask the question,
Then you are
let me
going
just
to
ask the
2.3
question a
million.
different way, and I think maybe this will make sense. If we save, in the first 2 years, if we save $2.3 million from the transition from CH to M Hill, do you want to spend any of that on anything in the city? Do you want to spend, and then if the answer to that is yes, then the question is, you want to spend it all or just a portion of it?
Okay.
That's really,
I think
Well,
we're-
can you
we're
answer
wants
that
to be
question?
conservative.
Spend or at least put it towards our reserves or put it towards
right.
acquisition or whatever.
Probably the better word is reallocate. You want to
We
reallocate
don't have to go
to
out and spend it, but
Right.
at least we can.
reallocate it to probably
And I can
capital
answer that
projects.
for me. I believe that of the 2.3 savings, we should fully fund the transportation plan.
So that's
Okay.
what, that brings us
And
to
then
6.
any amount that's left over that we can continue to talk about, whether that goes to savings or whether that goes to buy parks or whatever, but the transportation
Individually,
plan,
Collectively, you all kind of said that 6 is
Yeah.
the number you want.
Yeah.
You backed into it or whatever.
Yeah.
Although 6, that doesn't get, other than just funding our transportation, it doesn't
They
give
get-
us anything else for parks or any other infrastructure.
He's gonna find another $1 billion in the budget, he's gonna say.
But again, Joe, to your point, I mean, you guys are going to do this every year as you go through your budget cycle. This is solely from the standpoint of trying to create a model for the plan. 600 is in the middle. It's a known expense that you want
Known
to try and
expense.
support.
It will make Carter
It
happy.
doesn't say that there are other things out there. If Chris and you guys find additional savings, those additional savings are going to go to something else.
and I hope our Parks Authority will find lots of extra money for us
Well,
outside of our
you know,
budget.
Yeah, 6 is a safe number, Joe, from the standpoint of you're fully funding your transportation plan. You don't have to identify it today, there's no earmark where that 6 goes. And it still allows for flexibility when you do your budget plan, to either use it for things that have come up that are important, put it in your pocket, save it for a rainy day, or have them committed something else that happens. Or we find other savings, and that 6 becomes even larger number. But you gotta put a stake in the sand, and 6 is not, or a stake in the ground.
Yeah, and that's where I'm trying to come up with a number. To me
I
personally,
think Sam was right.
Well, yeah.
Red flag.
300 and 300.
what's that, Chris?
I was just asking, I was clarifying that the 600 was cumulative over 2 years versus 600,000.
Okay.
And that will fully fund our transportation plan.
But, and my only point is, but that's all it does.
That's all it does.
Again, Carter and I and Chris had a meeting this afternoon with some people, and, there's still a lot of stuff that's way behind, if the majority of council wants to go with the 6, I'm certainly fine with that. I'd just say, my personal opinion is put a little bit more in there, but let's
Well, hopefully some of that 12.1%
Go.
we're gonna find is savings that is real and not just.
yeah, but hopefully we don't have.
Remember, it's
Get that-
the
that's good.
establishing a model that's more concrete than we have to.
All right. Would,
Everything that comes back after we finish the model with those assumptions is still a variable you can.
would George and staff, would you say that kind of hitting the middle ground would be the 600, and it'd be a good starting point to go from, and
It's a good starting point as we get further into the land use process and start mapping out where some of these changes should and potentially could occur. We'll rerun and see how close we are and make some other recommendations, if there are other changes that you all need to make from a policy standpoint, again, to either the financial model or to our growth benchmark.
I'm going to say that I'd be in favor of using the existing zoning and the $600,000 number. Bill?
Yes.
Joe? Bert? Julie?
I'll support that and have one question.
Karen?
Sorry, no questions.
Alan?
We hate to ask questions.
All right, I got 6 and a question.
Transfer development rights, when we talk about, it's been something that has supposedly been central to the whole premise of additional density. So I would just ask that if we win, you start looking at these additional areas, that we not presume commercial without the inclusion of transfer development rights. We have said for a long, long time it's been a missed opportunity, and I would just urge us that if we're going to identify 133 acres in an area, that we don't do it without at the same time discussing where we're going to transfer that development right from and to. Otherwise, we're just going to end up right where we've been for a lot of years.
It's the two-part
Well, we've already said that if we're looking to send it to either Deerfield or send it to Arnold Miller, send it to Crabapple, my request would be that we don't just allow it to morph, but that we do it with the transfer of development right from interior to those areas. We've often talked about having sending areas and receiving areas.
Okay, but as far as your financial plan, you've got direction. You have what you need?
One other thing I heard that
Okay.
we'll do is we'll break out those one-time expenditures that are not operating expenses, so it'll show up as a line item.
And did I hear also it's going to be, we're going to look at a 10-year horizon, not just the 20? Because I think that starts to give some different benchmarks, correct?
We'll do that, but let's,
Some intermediate steps, yes.
Yeah, like a benchmark.
I mean, I think I heard concurrence with that.
I think, personally, I think from a land use map standpoint, that makes sense because it'll distinguish what we want to do in the first 10 versus the second 10. From a model standpoint, it's going to course.
What we'll do is just pick where that 10-year point is out there in the model and what the model told us. So we don't have to rerun the model.
I do want to say from all sincerity, thank you, George, and everybody on the committee. I know you guys have worked so hard, and I know we've been, not difficult, but, hard to get information from and get direction. Thank you for working with us, and staff, all the hard work, so. All right, where's our city clerk, if she wants to sound the next agenda?
I'll do it. Discussion of the Milton Trail and Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee. Welcome, Cindy. Yeah, come on up.
Want the hot seat.
I know hot seats.
Any committee members here?
Well, I will give a brief kind of intro into why this is up for discussion tonight.
kind of, obviously I provided a staff report to you last Monday, which got a little lengthy as I began to add information to it. So hopefully you've had a chance to review that. I'll just give an intro for those who aren't familiar with kind of why this has come up for discussion. Back in February, I was asked to sit down with some members of our bike ped committee, along with Chris, and Carter came in as well, to talk about the possibility of the Milton Trail Plan transitioning to a Parks and Recreation initiative from the Public Works Department. Not being familiar with the plan quite yet, I did a lot of homework. I talked to a lot of different people, staff, members of Bike Ped, Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, former members of Bike Ped, other consultants, trail builders, other cities who've gone through the trail building process. And a lot of questions kept resurfacing as I continued to talk with various people. So as these questions came up, I felt the need to try to address these questions. So I asked for input from the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee, as well as the Parks and Rec Advisory Board, as well as staff, about these three questions that kept coming up. One was, and I'll break these into two components after I go over the intro, but one was, would they support the Milton Trail Plan falling under Parks and Recreation at this point? Two, what were the defined responsibilities of the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee with regards to the trail plan, and had those responsibilities been met to date? If not, what were the ongoing responsibilities? And the third question was, would the transition to Parks and Recreation allow for the advisory board to serve in a similar capacity as the Bike Ped Committee has served over the last 3 years? So those are the questions that I kind of put out and got information back from a variety of different individuals. With regards to the trail plan, and I'll break it apart first. Obviously, we have a trail plan that's in place, that's been adopted, approved. We also have trail development standards that have been adopted and approved going forward. We've been talking about a plan all night. I think all of us realize that a plan is a dynamic, fluid document that serves as a guide to direct us, but needs to be reviewed regularly to make sure that what's identified in the plan is still priorities as we go forward. We need to consider, from a funding standpoint, from a maintenance standpoint, from a prioritization standpoint, kind of how we're going to implement the trail plan. You know, right now, as I mentioned in the staff report, we have roughly $200,000 set aside for matching trail funds for this year for implementation. There's also $100,000 set aside for sidewalk additions. That brings us to a total of $300,000 that we could begin a portion of trail implementation this year. Typically, right-of-way trails will run somewhere in the neighborhood of about $500,000 up to as much as $1 million. It varies depending on the materials being used, the width of the trail, what have you, all the infrastructure, if there are infrastructure improvements that need to be made. Per mile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, $500,000 to $1 million per mile.
Would also include acquisition of.
Yes, if any right-of-way acquisition needed to be made, that would include that as well, any surveys, drainage issues. And I'll preface what I'm saying, also saying that just because if this transition to a Parks and Recreation initiative, it doesn't mean that Public Works is no longer involved. So we will be working very closely with Public Works and Community Development towards implementation. We have met on a staff level to see what is the practicality of us going ahead and moving forward with some form of implementation this year. You know, staff basically recommends if we use that $300,000 that we identify an area. The first area identified in the plan for implementation is the stretch from Milton High School up Freemanville to Phillips Circle. That's about 2.7 miles. Well, based on the numbers I just gave you per mile, we obviously don't have that money to move forward. So we would probably just do a segment of that, most likely Milton High School to Landrum. Once you cross Landrum, obviously there is a stream there and would require a 110-foot pedestrian suspension crossing there, which is very, very expensive to include. So if we were to get from Milton High School to Landrum, that would basically cover the costs possibly that we have budgeted for this year. We've looked at possibly doing a survey, obviously, to begin with, and then issuing it as a RFQ type bid process with a design build option with an RFP component, to try to obviously save money with a design build type option. That's the first part. It's kind of an update on where we are with the trail plan. There's another option too. We could forego that first phase and find another area that may be used for a test strip, a test section that may add some connectivity somewhere else identified in the city, outside of the phasing that was identified in the plan, just so that we have a good feel for how our materials, our surface, is going to work for us going forward for the uses that we have projected. Second part of it is obviously the questions that I mentioned earlier, is kind of how do we make this transition? Is what is in place now needed going forward? Is there a way to combine kind of what we've had with kind of where we are going forward? And so I've kind of come up with 3 options, and there are probably more, but these are the 3 that really stand out to me the most. One is the trail plan implementation and bike pedestrian path committee would remain in Public Works. However, Sarah Leaders will be leaving in May and serves as the staff liaison right now for the trail plan and the bike ped committee. Right now, staff recommendation and the committee recommendation are kind of at a standstill. Staff's recommendation does not line up entirely with what the committee is recommending at this point. So we've got to figure out a way to get past this impasse that we're having right now. The second option would be to move the trail implementation and the bike pedestrian path committee to Parks and Recreation. However, just moving from one department to the other is not going to eliminate this issue we're having with staff recommendation versus the committee recommendation. Because even though it's moving from Public Works to Parks, having doing all my research, my staff recommendation would be the same as it has been in Public Works. If for some reason the direction of the committee changes, that may work. We would be able to move forward. This could also allow the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee to fall under the Parks and Rec Advisory Board or to stand alone. The problems with the committee standing alone outside of the advisory board is they may not see the big picture of what's going on in Parks and Recreation. And I think that would be an added bonus to be able to see all of the initiatives that are going on with Parks and Recreation in addition to just the trail plan. The third option would be to have the trail plan implementation move under Parks and Recreation and the committee be dissolved in some capacity with their responsibilities. And again, I still don't know really kind of what their current responsibilities are going forward. Those responsibilities would fall under the Parks and Rec Advisory Board. I feel like our Parks and Rec Advisory Board would be able to handle those responsibilities. We have a very diverse group on our advisory board. They have all been asked, and all of them agree that it's something that they feel should be a Parks and Rec initiative and that they could handle. We currently have one member of the Bike Pedestrian Path Committee who also serves on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board. We have the ability to create subcommittees for the Parks and Rec Advisory Board, which we currently have 3 standing subcommittees. We could just establish a 4th. That would be the Trail Plan Subcommittee. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the Trail Plan. I wanted to give you an update, kind of get some discussion going as to how you feel we can move forward. And then second, to kind of address the whole issue of the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee, what their responsibilities are, should they continue, should they transition. So
I have a question, and we may or may not be able to answer this. Does anybody, going back when we first implemented this committee, what the expectations were. Was it, to get a product done and then turn it over, or was it to continue on? Was there any thoughts on that or expectations?
I had that question too.
Initially, it was set up to come up with a plan. I mean, that was the initial, if you look at what they were, the grant was originally gotten for, it was to come up with a plan.
Plan and design.
But just really to come up with a plan for what, and the plan is more than just putting lines on the map. It was also as far as surface types and things like that.
And design too.
But that was what they were. They were the ones that really asked to continue on in their capacity once we approved the plan. But if you look at what the original grant was for, it was to come up with a plan.
And I'll just give you everybody a little background on what I'm hearing and sensing and with committee members, staff, everybody. Strictly business, it probably makes total sense, as Cindy said, and probably the third option. Having it under Parks and Rec and, not just basically eliminate the committee. Now, saying that, I also realize there are several individuals that have been on that committee that have put a lot of work and have a lot of their heart in it. I like you mentioned a subcommittee, and I had mentioned also too, possibly, having an additional member on the Parks and Rec or an ex officio, person or whatever, so that there could, but the idea with the subcommittee, somebody that could report back and get input, but also is not maybe in the day-to-day, letting staff take it forward and moving forward. So, again, from what I hear, that might make sense.
Well, I don't want to cut you off.
No,
I just
no,
want to let you know
yeah.
I've got something to say whenever you were done. If you're done, I'll just.
I'm done.
Cindy was probably very nice and was very nice in her presentation. I don't know if I'm known for being so nice or not, but I'm going to tell you what the problem I've got at this point is that there are some on the Bike and Pedestrian Committee who are bringing forward a recommendation that our city staff just is not going to be able to support, period. Building public trails in the right-of-way is not blazing a trail on private property. It just isn't. There are standards that, we could blaze trails all day for you in the right-of-way and probably trim down the cost. We could even probably blaze a trail in the right-of-way between Milton High School and Phillips Circle and trim the cost way down. But then you're going to come to us in 2 years when, a portion of it washes away because we didn't take any consideration as to what the topography was, or we don't put in the right retaining wall and all of a sudden we have a mudslide, or we get to the bridge and, we dip down and don't put the right kind of elements in place to make sure that the trails are safe. I mean, this is going to become a linear part of our parks and recreation system. So the dilemma that we have right now, which Cindy nicely described as impasse between certain members of the committee, is we have some that are recommending we just get out there and start cutting trails, and then we've got some that say, no, we need to back up and we have trail standards we need to adhere to, and we're going to put this thing in the right of way, and if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we adhere to a certain set of standards. Never mind the fact that we need to adhere to a certain set of standards so we remain a viable recipient of grant monies should they exist. There's certain requirements that you have to be able to even apply for some of these grants. And I don't know exactly how, from a staff perspective, we're certainly not here in a position where we openly and candidly just decide we want to disagree with a committee that the council's placed. But this is one, just if I'm being honest with you tonight, we're not going to get to a place that we can ever as a staff, and if you're asking for a recommendation, we're not going to get to a place that we can support that. I just want you to know that that's kind of what we're dealing with, is a couple of different viewpoints on the committee. I don't know what we do to break through that. I don't know that we don't just look at this and say, do in fact we have redundancy? Has this committee actually delivered what they were intended to deliver by the resolution that created them? And that maybe we have an opportunity for some consolidation right now. Not that we're not interested in hearing what people who are very passionate about it have to say or even keeping them involved. But where we are right now is stuck. And we need to get unstuck if we're going to bring this trail into an actual reality. Right now, it looks great on paper, but on paper, it's not helping anybody out there who wants to walk on it. So, you know, Cindy was nice at saying what she said, and you know, let me just paint the real picture for y'all so that you know kind of what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I don't know if our representative who serves on the Bike and Ped wants to talk tonight or not, if you'd even allow that.
Not, you know, well, actually, I didn't ask for public comment, but
I had
like
to
you have
find
a
it. I take
card.
it back. I didn't want to be the only one
No,
speaking.
go ahead.
To make it clear, you're only speaking for yourself.
And I am only speaking for myself. I love me to both committees. So I'm on the Parks and Recs committee, which, you know, we understand what our mandate is. We work well together. We divided the work, communicate well. When Cindy's talking about meeting with the committee, as a member of the Bike Ped committee, I had no idea they were coming down to meet with her. I thought I had tried to be a liaison between staff and certain members of the committee. And then next thing I hear, they've gone and had a meeting representing the whole committee without my knowledge or even communicating back to me after they met. So it's not the whole committee. You know, the committee is not united in that. As a member of the Parks and Rec committee, I think we can handle this as a linear park, as it's handled in a lot of other cities. A subcommittee is not a bad idea. The trail committee has done yeoman's work in developing plans. They really have. And there are people on that committee who are enthusiastic supporters. But I think the committee has lost its way. I don't know. I've been on the committee for a year. I don't know what the mandate is. Parks and Rec, we understand what the mandate is. We know how to put things together and how to make things run and how to work with staff and just to do what our job is and to let staff do what their job is. So as a member of both committees, I would recommend that we move the function under the Parks and Rec Advisory Board.
Yeah, and I just want to echo Shelley's sentiments, and as I'm reading through the report, I think there's a whole paragraph dedicated to my previous appointee to this committee as well, who could have been an asset to the city in that capacity, and I trust her judgment as well. And I've long been concerned with all of the committees that we have and what seem to be overlapping yet complementary charges. I know that when the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee was formed, they were given the charge of planning and designing that trail, and they have done a wonderful job doing that. But now that we have a full-time Parks and Rec director, in terms of staff time, best use of staff time, efficiency, trying to funnel our resources and efforts to get funding for the trails and for parks, I think it all needs to be under one. And we need to thank the Parks and the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee for their efforts and get on with it.
Well, Cindy. No. I think Bill has a question.
Oh, yeah.
My recollection is the initial charge was, like Alan was saying, was to develop a route and design standards. And my recollection is it would sunset after that charge was satisfied. I guess the question is, at the rate of, say, $1 million per mile for trails, how many miles did we anticipate?
Carter may have to correct me, but I'm pretty sure it's between 70 and 80 miles. Now, some of that is already counting our gravel road system.
Right, 13 miles.
Some of them are counting the existing sidewalks and paths that are already in place.
Okay, I
So
guess this goes back to the budget thing and projecting how this thing's going to develop over the years. So we're going to have a bike and trail committee in existence until we spend $80 million. We're talking about a long time out there.
I'll be in Milton Green.
You're going?
I'll be in Milton Green by then. In the fields, whatever.
Did you reserve your
We'll have a gravel pathway that goes right there.
So I guess my thinking is, And I appreciate the effort this committee's put into this. There's a lot of hard work, and you see the results of it. I've mentioned in the past, the gravel roads are already in existence. They are a paths, and they represent linear parks. So, in essence, the paths are parks, and I think they should be included or under that auspices of the Parks and Rec Committee. Also, since they are in a right-of-way, they still should have the direction and guidance of the Public Works Department. So however that works, without, I'm sure Carter would appreciate the added burden there. But, you know, it is certainly a part of what he does. It should be. I'm not one to waste resources, not one to reinvent the wheel, but I think if we have the resources in place in Parks and Rec, and we have the plan, we have the design standards, and the other part of that question is to what workload does Parks and Rec have at this point in time?
A lot.
Well, I guess that's a question. I don't know the answer to it. But would you think adding this this duty to Parks and Rec, that it would overload a 7-person board?
Oh, I don't think so. You know, there are so many Parks and Rec initiatives that have been identified. You know, adding one more is not going to make that much difference. It actually, to me, will help because we're able to look at all of them and have a balance as we move forward with a long-term comprehensive plan that will include trails, that will be revisited on a regular basis as we revisit master plans, as we revisit that comprehensive plan. Obviously, as things change in Milton, you know, as things change with community development, as things change with Public Works, what's been identified as the plan as priorities right now may change because we may realize that there's some other connectivity that comes on board that's going to take priority. For example, a new school coming into the community. Obviously, we'll refocus our attention on making sure there's connectivity to that new school as well as the other existing schools that we currently have in place.
Can I just, and I'll address something too, just so, which we're talking about, Bill brings up the budget, and I know do some math and do 70 miles and $1 million a mile. $70 million sounds, you know, a shocking huge number. You know, clarify too, also Cindy said 500,000 to $1 million, and we know that, you know, the gravel roads are going to be much less. We do have a lot of, you know, as people are developing areas, they've got to put the trails and whatnot in. So, you know, it's not going to be that much. You know, I don't want people just to think we're talking about $70 million and, you know, it'll take forever. So
The money allocated.
Coming out of your slush fund. No problem.
The money needed, identified in the plan in 2007, was around $5.5 million that would be needed to carry us forward. Again, that's taking into account some things are already existing, some things are going to be added with commercial development that's coming on board. You know, so $5.5 million has already been identified 3 years ago.
So we're working with somewhere between 5.5 and 70 million.
Yes.
Give or
If
take
that
a
makes it
million.
any easier, yes.
All right, and I think probably what we ought to do is just kind of go around the, you know, around the room. And Joe, do you want to give your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be in favor of doing what Cindy thinks is most appropriate. I don't see having committees, you know, stay in existence that don't serve a particular function. I mean, it can be frustrating for the people on the committee, and just having read your report, obviously, it has been frustrating for some folks. So, so I would see moving that under Parks and Rec, and either having some kind of transition period for the existing committee to transfer whatever knowledge needs to be transferred, but then long-term having it go away would be a fine approach.
Okay. Bert?
I would have to agree with whatever our professional staff thinks is best. Then I would like to extend thanks to the Bike and Ped Committee if it does end up going away for what they've done. But I do think we could tap some of those resources that might get frustrated in other things if we can use them somewhere else. So I'm all for number 3.
Julie?
I support efficiency of committees. I think, Joe, you mentioned early on that it's part of what Councilmember Gordon just said too, knowledge transfer. So one question I have, and maybe it's a hybrid maybe of one of these, and that is how to make sure that as part of that knowledge transfer, that whether it's a subset of Parks and Rec, not necessarily expanding the existing Parks and Rec board, but as part of the acknowledgement of the time and the effort, but not just the time and effort, but the knowledge. Because I think that the key is, what do we do to ensure that we have the best knowledge base there to help our new director, obviously, and staff move forward. So I don't know that I have the right solution for that, but I think that, as the mayor said, that maybe there's some hybrid, and I'll use that word because I know you didn't use that word, but maybe there is a way to leverage some of the resources from the existing committee, the Trail Bike and Ped, because some of those folks obviously do have a tremendous knowledge base, and I think that we might take 2 steps backwards if we don't make sure that we have all of that knowledge transfer. So whether it's through an ex officio member or members to the Bike and Ped committee for a period of time, maybe it's for the next 6 months, maybe it's for the next, I don't know. And another question I had just is whether or not both of these groups have come together, Cindy, with you. Has there been one time that everybody got in the room together and just had healthy dialogue to say, what are they together, not just answering the survey, but I'm in the Parks and Rec as well as the Bike and Ped, just coming together with your leadership to say, okay, guys, we've got to find a hybrid that allows this committee, one, to transition out. And I don't know that you've all been in that one room together.
Not yet. I was waiting to kind of get a consensus on what direction.
So maybe that'll be a healthy way to look for some solutions that hopefully both committees can talk about with because right now we don't have obviously all the parties of either committee here. So I just would hate to tonight say that we know exactly what that formation is. Obviously I support, your professional assessment. I would just ask for you guys to look at that hybrid, which is either some form of a subcommittee that maybe is ex officio, but just to help that knowledge transfer. And as an example, that $40,000, is that realistic? I don't know. But let's make sure that we don't lose those contacts and that work that's been done if there's an opportunity for cost savings and or if contacts have been created.
Okay, Karen?
I agree that it may be time for a change for the sake of efficiency. I don't think it hurts us to have one less committee as a city. I think Chris wouldn't mind having one less committee. I think what these guys are very passionate about is actually getting trails in place. And maybe what we can do, they've got this $40,000 per mile number. If once we determine where in Birmingham Park we're going to put trails in, maybe they could be used for that. And quite honestly, they ought to be able to do it less than $40,000 per mile. We did 2.5 miles at Milton High School for $25,000, including 3 bridges. So they ought to be able to do that. But maybe that's where they could really feel like they have accomplished something, and they can get out there and actually, once our Parks Committee knows where those general areas and all those trails are going to be, I don't think they can do anything until we know where we're going to be. I think we got a little idea because there are certain areas that can't be anything but trails. But I think those guys could maybe use their research and their skills to actually do some stuff up there, and they may be a good one to do it, to let them use it, but yet let our Parks Committee take over all the stuff on the right of way, or else we're going to get into a competition between parks and bike and pedestrian pathway if we're not careful.
Okay, Alan?
Yeah, and I've already made my sentiments known, and I haven't changed those. But I would just, you guys have raised some good points about transitioning and some of that transfer of knowledge that is important. So if staff could somehow fit that in, that would be good too.
Yeah, what I might recommend is, as we've talked, I think we're all on the same page, but maybe let staff and some of the committees, you guys formulate a direction and a way to make this happen, and just let us know. But I think it's fairly clear that the council supports your general direction, but just, kind of let us know how you want to exactly transition it, and again, keeping in mind that we want certainly, we certainly all want to thank the members up to this point, what they've done, and also keep them in the loop and work with them, in the right way. Okay. Anything else?
No. Good meeting y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Saving money.
Yeah.
Saving money. Yeah. Do what?